Thank you all for coming today. This is an interesting experience. Steve is my former boss, so I get to introduce my former boss.
Yeah.
Oregon's reputation as a liberal, environmentally progressive state can be traced to U.S. Senator Richard L. Neuberger, whose election in 1954 has impacted Oregon politics for the past 72 years. For 40 years, author and former newspaper publisher Steve Forrester researched Neuberger's life. Today, he is discussing his book, Richard Neuberger, Oregon Politics and the Making of a U.S. Senator. And the books are here for sale as well. Thank you, Ken. A consequential but nearly forgotten figure in Oregon history, Neuberger was, Steve says, one of the most significant Oregonians of the first half of the 20th century. Steve was a journalist for 50 years, 33 of those years as editor and publisher of the Daily Astorian. He and 4 colleagues founded the Willamette Week newspaper in 1974, and in 1978 he operated a news bureau in Washington, D.C. In 1963, Steve served as a page for Maureen Neuberger in the U.S. Senate. The first Democrat to be elected to the U.S. Senate from Oregon in 40 years, Richard Neuberger was an outspoken liberal who supported workers' rights and civil rights. He shaped Oregon's renowned conservation policies and developed the state's modern Democratic Party. Neuberger was also a journalist from an early age, writing for the Oregonian as a teenager and for the New York Times while still in college. While a student at the University of Oregon in 1933, Neuberger, a Jew, visited Hitler's Germany for 7 weeks and interviewed relatives and others about the rising violence toward Jews in the country. Neuberger's stories about his visit appeared in national publications throughout the United States. His editor at The Nation magazine called it an epoch-making article. A prolific freelance writer, Neuberger published 6 books and over 700 articles before his death of a cerebral hemorrhage in 1960, 9 months before the end of his Senate term. He was 47 years old. So, Steve, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thanks everybody for coming. It's very good to be here. And we have photos here, which we'll probably in audio that will play in advance. And then I know Nancy and Mike are going to ask me questions and so forth. And so I brought an audio. This is one of his radio commercials during the 1954 campaign. So you can see what he sounded like. And what's useful to know is that he put 85% of his campaign budget into radio. He understood that early on that this was the way to do it in 1954.
The infuriating newspaper.
I don't know what he did in newspapers. He knew all those people, so he probably did something to make them happy. I don't know. Nonetheless, let's hear the commercial. There's 2 things about that radio commercial. It's true of all of them. One aspect is he never when they introduced him, he said, "Your candidate," they said, "not your Democratic candidate," because in 1954 that was a totally new thing. He was the first articulate, period, liberal. The best description of the Democratic Party before him was given to me by one of his former aides, who said it was very inarticulate. And if they were articulate, they were very unimpressive. And so, but he didn't say your Democratic candidate because Oregon was a Republican state, had been for half a century. And the second thing about it is, you'll notice he never mentions his opponent, just my opponent. He did that early on in his campaign, and Wayne Morris said, don't be doing that. Don't be telling people his name and all that sort of thing. So should we see some of the photos? There, that's his high school senior photo from Lincoln High School. And I've shown it to his nieces, who they knew the Neubergers. They were treated like daughters of the Neubergers. And she said, he's very full of himself. He's just ambitious to take on the world and so forth. And what's interesting, I don't have this other photo in my projection, but the other one I have is his year after being at the University of Oregon and the editor of the Daily Emerald, where he'd been knocked around quite a bit for his radical views. He clearly looks much more world weary in that photo. What else you got? That's him on the way to Germany in the there on shipboard. He went there with his uncle Julius. Julius was an MD trained at the University of Oregon Medical School, as it was called in those days, and he was fluent in German. So he was Neuberger's guide to where they were going because they did not speak German. And what they did was they went to the small towns and hamlets in Germany. And the details of what they found is in my book, because he wrote about it in 2 or 3 articles and spoke about it to the American Jewish Congress executive in that. And there, many of it, most of it, I should say, you will recognize as what we know now. We've seen it in movies like the one about Spielberg movie, Schindler's List. And but then it was not known. People did not know what was going on in Germany. It was not in the American press at all. So he comes back and he tries to sell it to the New York Times. They did not buy it, and Nick's mother told me that they didn't feel they could substantiate what he'd reported. So he figured he goes down the street to the Nation magazine and sells it to a guy named Ernest Greening. Later would be his Senate colleague as U.S. Senator, and for $38, which is enough for tuition for the next term or whatever, U of O. And so the importance of what he sees in Germany is sort of threefold, I guess you would say. One is he revealed all these details that no one was reporting, and it was an eye-opener, of course, across America. Secondly, his exposure through that article and through all the Jewish newspapers in America. And in those days, every big city had one. Would republish the article or do their own version of it. That made him an instant celebrity on the East Coast. But yeah, certainly on the East Coast. And he knew some of the biggest names in Jewish public life. Felix Frankfurter, who becomes Supreme Court judge, and Louis Brandeis, who was a Supreme Court justice. And so the third thing is, he comes back to Oregon, to the University of Oregon, and let's see the next slide. And he's had his vision wide raised. He sees at this point, he sees well beyond the boundaries of the U of O or Eugene in the way that most students don't. So if you think about it in modern terms, it was an incredible year abroad program for him, and like which no one was doing in those days. So then he gets to, we get to the run up to World War II, and this is an interesting thing here because in his articles, as you will see, he predicts in 1933, we're going to go to war with Germany, and That's where Hitler is taking us. And so this is 1938 on the lawn at Reed College. And what happened on many college campuses at this time in 1938 was a student strike. So Reed put it to work, and they had events, of course, surrounding the war. So here he is debating a guy named Oscar Gass, who's sitting with the glasses on behind him. And Gass was a Reed graduate and a Rhodes Scholar, and he took the side that we had to go into war. And Dick, surprisingly to me, and I've found to many other readers, the peace side, stay out of the war. But it was not untypical of men his age. For reasons you might grasp, John Kennedy, a future Senate colleague, made the same argument in an article in the Crimson magazine, editorial in Crimson newspaper at Harvard, which his biographer describes as being very naive because of what Kennedy knew through his father having been ambassador to Great Britain and so on and so forth. So, and also, it was not untypical of all college campuses in the sense that when there were student ballots on whether to enter the war or not entering won. That's across the West Coast and back east. So here he is with his mother, and Ruth, in her own right, Ruth Lewis Neuberger, was quite a presence. I met her. I had the great fortune to meet her. One of my historian friends was surprised when I said, well, his mother said this, and she said, most people who write biographies never meet the mother. You could quote her. And so she was for years I guess you call a stay-at-home mom, if you will. And although they had a nurse for the children and a cook. And so she played bridge and did some things like that. And then all of a sudden she had to run the family business, which is the restaurants, the Bohemian restaurants in Portland. At the height, there were 5 of them and a plethora of bakeries. And she took her husband, Isaac, known as Ike, was a compulsive gambler. And I knew there was this family secret. I didn't know what it was, but I early on, I got the drift that something was not working. It had not worked. So I had dinner one night with a woman named Elizabeth Ducey, and if you've ever been around Portland politics, liberal Portland politics, you would have known who Elizabeth Ducey was. She was a California timber heiress, never married, had a lot of money, and gave to every liberal cause. And so I asked Elizabeth, I said, what was it? That's some of that. Was it drinking? What was it? She said, they were estranged. That's all she said. And then when I made my first talk about this years ago, before I wrote the book, to the Oregon Jewish Museum annual meeting, one of the 2 nieces, Kate Goodsell Marquez, who lives in Klamath Falls, came up to me with the minutes of the Bohemian restaurant special meeting, which had happened right before Dick left for the war. And Ike was removed from his role, and Ruth was installed in a new role, and Dick was put on the board, and so forth. So, and throughout his life, which you will see in the book, his father was an embarrassment. And he would get a call in the US Senate saying, from a Portland businessman, sometimes Jewish, sometimes not, and saying, your father owes me $100. And he said, you're good for it. And so he's one of the 3 factors that propelled Dick into the 1954 race. One was they knew they had a shot. Democrats knew they had a shot because the registration had shifted in Oregon pre-war. That was one. The second was how badly he'd been treated at the UVO. And as his top aide said, he wanted to rub their noses in it, all those students. Third one was Ike. He wanted to be something, not what Ike had been. So what's next? Yeah, there he is. Phenomenal writer. Nancy McCarthy and I, before we started, we're talking about Wilma Morrison, who's quoted in the book, because Wilma was a teacher of both of ours and lived in Canada Beach at the end of her life. And we come down here to see her, in fact. And she said that Dick would come into the newsroom of the Oregonian, and she said, you know how most of us put paper in the plat, and this is a manual typewriter, and we write a little, we stop and rethink things, or we stop and have a cigarette and then rethink. In those days, you spoke in the newsroom. And Dick would come in and put the paper in the plat and start writing, and he wouldn't stop until he got to the end of the article. He had it totally conceived in his head. Who does that? No one I know. And for God's sake. And she said it was like a teletype going off next to you. Very intimidating to be around. The other thing that struck her, that she observed, was that he was very insecure, which he was. I have lots of testimony to that effect in the book. And basically an insecure man, which you see often in people you think who are very public, entertainers sometimes, and their ego can be easily shattered. And that was the case with Dick. And Wilma describes a letter coming in one day from a reader of one of his articles, many articles, and who took him to task for something. And he just couldn't handle it. He said, I was so surprised that he was that affected by it, because he was so big, so popular, so articulate, and so forth. That was the case. What's next? So this is the marriage to Maureen, which happens after the war, and she enters politics along with Dick. And the story of how that happened, there are two versions of it. One he tells and one she tells. Isn't that always the truth? I guess. But nonetheless, he wrote many of his articles were, as I put it in the book, he narrated his own life. How I got my first job. My wife put me in the Senate when I learned that I got cancer, and so forth. And they're all very revelatory in one way or the other. So in the one about his wife going into politics, he says that they were in the wilderness and she was bent over the fire making sourdough biscuits. And so he comes to her and she said, I think I will run. And he said, oh. And so, but if you read her oral history, one of her oral histories, she's done more than one. I read the one in the Library of Congress, done by the former members of Congress. And she says that was not the case. The way it worked was, he always said that to her, if you want to make change, you got to get a vote in the Senate or the House in Oregon legislature. That you can't just go to legal and women voters meetings and talk about these things. You got to go, get a seat at the table. And so she acceded to that. And it may have happened on this trip, probably, because they were traveling at the time and they were about to go to Spokane, where she said to file her name for the state house. He was in the state senate by then. And so Dick picked up the phone and called Monroe Sweetland, whom you will see in the book what he was, and party chairman, and said, file Maureen's name. So the effect of that had at least a couple of great outcomes for them. Having do the same name on the ballot twice was better for both. And the more modern equivalent was the Roberts name for years. No longer is that. There's Roberts around, is there? Nobody on the ballot or not running or in the legislature. There's Barbara and Frank and Wendy and so on and so forth. So it had that benefit, but also there's a question of whether he created Maureen. Was it a Pygmalion sort of a thing, or and his brother-in-law, Dick's brother-in-law, Jim Goodsell, makes the point that when he realized that Maureen was getting it and had a mind of her own about all this stuff, it's going, oh, well. But there's a photo in the book that in the legislature that I think where he's sitting with her at her desk that just speaks volumes in terms of if you read into it, what I do at least. So that's the nature of it. Then the other thing I will tell you about Maureen is that my wife and I went to interview Maureen when she lived in retirement on Westover Road in Portland, and I would record my interviews, of course. And I asked her a question I was curious about, of course, which was, who were your friends in D.C. when Dick was alive? You know, who did you see socially? Because in those days they did see each other socially. They didn't fly home on the weekends because the commercial jet wasn't a common thing anymore, or already, I should say. And summer kept them in Washington and all that sort of thing. And she stopped and she cried, and I'd never seen it, and so forth. And so she cried, and then she got it. That ended. And she said, "Well, I haven't done that in a while." She said, "Well, you know, when Dick was alive, and I really didn't think I did that much for him in the office. And now that then when I was elected, I realized I needed a wife, which was someone to help me, but also someone to talk to." And I shared this with Dick Baker, who was the Senate historian, and he said, "That's what I tell freshman senators within each new class. You need someone to talk to, someone who doesn't want anything from you and need anything from you, and so forth." And you can well imagine that is the case. And she never had that. Her colleague was Wayne Morris, who, as you will see in the book, we'll get to him when he sees public. So this is a very interesting campaign poster for a couple of reasons. One, Hells Canyon was a big deal. And like so many environmental issues, it morphed over time into what it was. And in those days, it was whether to build a high dam, so-called high dam, owned by the public, or a series of small dams owned by Idaho Power. And it was decided, of course, public power, which you'll see. But the second thing I find remarkable is somehow they expected people to power all that verbiage. Can you imagine that today? Yeah, no. And so please show the next slide. So this is also interesting to me. You know, who would have a pin today? Environmentalists for Wyden or whoever. Because environmentalism today, it's never been more than a secondary issue in all races and so forth. And in those days, it was called conservation. Once Rachel Carson comes along, shortly after Dick dies, and writes The Silent Spring, or is published, I should say, and environmentalism comes into the lexicon. And so the giveaway, that was his stock phrase in the campaign, is that Guy courting his opponent. And the Eisenhower administration had given away the natural resources, be they timber resources or offshore tidal lands and so forth. And what's next? So this is election day, which is quite a story in itself. And so Dick and Maureen lived, you'll see the look on his face. He's not amused by what's going on there. And the little girl is Anne Goodsell, lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts now. And Anne was a student at Ainsworth School. Ainsworth was the Neuberger's polling place, and they lived about 5 blocks from it, I believe. And so they walked to the polls, and Anne meets them at the playground. And as they cross the playground, students booed Neuberger. The Neubergers are living in enemy territory, Portland Heights. And because of their, hard to say, you'd have to ask all the children who were going, where did you get this feeling about this man? It was all the talk. Perhaps it was a big race. Everybody knew, I say everybody, anybody who was going to vote knew this was a big deal. but with the, in Portland Heights, it may have been because he was Jewish, but certainly because he was Democrat. Um, and so Anne is crying there. And the first time I interviewed Anne and her sister Kate, this was a very fresh memory to her still. And if you would have had her, if I had her ever around, she would have a hard time telling you the story without crying. So, because again, they were like parents to her, and to see him treated that way. So this is it. The top event. He wins, and it took 3 days to count. He was finally declared the winner on Thursday after the Tuesday election, and in those days, those were all the editions of the newspapers in Portland over that period of time. And the story of election night is interesting itself because it really revealed how how fragile his ego was. Because the early returns were for Guy Gordon, and so they knew it was going to be close. They just didn't know how close. And most of the polls, which you'll see in the book, some thought it would be a runaway, but Gordon obviously was not. So Neuberger sees those, and he tells Monroe Sweetland on the phone. He says that he's going to concede. And he said, it's okay. I'll never do politics again. I can make a good living as a writer. I need to do this. And Monroe says, don't talk to anyone else. Don't call anyone else. Go to bed for a while, and we'll talk again at 5 a.m. or whatever it was. And the votes begin to shift. And up in Eastern Oregon, which is one of the many interesting details about this story, is that it was rural Oregon that elected Neuberger in many cases. Eastern Oregon did. I grew up in Pendleton, and my father was a newspaper editor there. And so, starting with Umatilla County, going on up into the Blue Mountains, Union County, Wallowa counties, they all went for Neuberger. And that radio commercial we played, there's a similar one aimed at the farm vote. In those days, there was a farm vote. And I cite the number of farms that were in existence then as opposed to now, and their amount of acreage and so forth. And it was not a good year for farmers. And so he appealed to that. The Eisenhower farm program was not popular. So that's who turned the tide. The last precinct to be counted in Oregon was in Umatilla County. So you'll see in that he called my dad to say, which way is it going to go, and so forth.
Just but as a sidebar, that I think interesting how many newspapers there were in Portland, Oregon at that time.
Oh yeah, well that's the Oregonian and the Journal.
But I see like 6, or that different issues. Maybe.
Different editions.
Editions. Okay.
Yeah.
I see.
The Oregonian had 5 editions in one day. The deadline is 5 deadline today.
Yeah.
The Oregonian.
Anyway.
Yeah. I think this is young Tom McCall, and it's a fascinating relationship. You'll see, Tom was, you may know this, he was HEW TV in Portland, King Broadcasting. And when Dick was doing the plan with Indian tribe termination and the disposal of its timber resources, King did a documentary, something you probably see these days. And I forgot what the title of it was, but it was a and Tom was put in charge of that. He was the producer of that. So he was always as Brent Wolf says in Fire Deeds Gate, he was a role model for McCall. And there he is. There's Wayne Morris, who was talk about a complicated relationship between the two of them. He was Dick's teacher at the University of Oregon when he was in law school. And essentially flunks him in criminal law, which moves him out of the university. Probably a good thing for Dick. He probably could have been a good lawyer, great lawyer, but he was a better writer. I asked the question of Dick's sister, Jane. I said, why'd you go to Oregon? Because she said it was a surprise to me that he went there because he's Jewish. He's been an outsider the whole time. But was that the family thought that being a writer was not a stable profession. It wasn't. It still isn't. But being a lawyer would be, ignoring the fact that until 1950, a major Portland firm would not hire a Jew. So he would have been in solo practice and I think Herb Schwab, your former mayor here, started, I think, in solo practice with, I think, Jack Beatty partnership. And or you'd be a government lawyer. So that was their first relationship. Then he leaves the university and they maintain a correspondence. And Dick was two things at least. He was prolific as a writer, and he was prodigious, and he was precocious. He was so precocious that he approached Neuberger, Morris, 12 years his senior, as his intellectual peer. It worked. Morris could recognize that this, as he called it, a boy, had the chops to be a U.S. senator. So so then they become. He becomes Morris's protege in terms of public life and writing and running for office. And then when in both of their campaigns, they both raised money for each other. They both spoke on each other's behalf. And so that all went on, another partnership, if you will. And then they're together in the Senate as they are here. And it ended very badly, in the most bitter feud in Senate history. And you want to know why it happened? It's in the book. There's more than one version of that. You put them all together, you kind of got what happened. But to me, the most revealing detail of all, and it at least feeds part of my analysis of what went on, is that Morris, you see this in their correspondence over the years. He allowed Dick to touch him emotionally, and I think in all relationships, if there ever is a break, it's harder if you really had an emotional relationship with the person. But one day when I was doing research at the University of Oregon, I was looking through Charles Porter's papers. Charlie Porter was the congressman from Eugene, representing Southern Oregon, and I wanted to see what was there. His son Don Porter, and curious. So in this paper, mislocated, here was this postcard from Morris to Dick and Maureen. It says from India, and Morris had been there on a Foreign Relations Committee trip, and so he's in the postcard. He says that how valuable this has been, and he closes the postcard by saying, "Love." What looks like love to you both. Well, Dick didn't say love to anyone except maybe his daughters.
Morris.
I'm sorry, Morris didn't. Thank you, Ben. So I took a picture of it, of course, then blew it up, and it says love. So that was just weeks before the feud broke out. So it really put the lie to the notion that somehow, which as you'll see the book, two other authors subscribe to, which is that this was the U of O relationship come back in life. I don't think so. So your question, Mike and Nancy.
Well, getting back to Nazi Germany and the war, it's baffling to me that he was sort of an isolationist. I know you write that he thought that Europe should be able to bear the brunt of the fighting against Hitler, but I'm sure when he was on the East Coast and writing in the nation, his relationship with the nation and everything, he must have known the horrors that were going on, in the camps and
Yeah.
I mean, he was there in 33 was when Hitler got appointed, I guess.
Yeah.
So just amazing to me that he was he didn't say, they send in the bombers and let's get going, boys.
Yeah. No, very true. It is baffling. And he never talked to. What's interesting too is he, that type thing, he has on his screen, he said that article was, he never spoke of it again.
Mm.
The first time I ever saw anyone talk was greeting, and he said that at Dick's funeral, his eulogy, in the Senate.
So he must have had some remorse.
I don't know.
Mm.
I asked William Robbins, emeritus professor of history at the University of Oregon, who's been very helpful to me at Oregon State. I'm sorry. I said to him, I don't get it. Here he'd been there, he saw all this stuff, and he said, well, Dick was always moving on to the next project. That's what he said.
Mm.
So, because Bill has done some very useful books on environmental law in Oregon, its development, its where it came from, and all that. And so he has often taken issue with Dick over his support of certain dams, and that too is an ultimate contradiction. His first article in the New York Times, I think, as the Northwest Correspondent, was about the dams on the new dam on the Columbia. And I don't know if he was writing about Bonneville or Grand Coulee or whatever, but he uses this fictional Indian chief, which he was fond of, and saying that more dam means less fish, etc. So he knew that was the case, and he's conservationist. So, but at that time too, dams were seen as kind of a savior in many ways. So it's a trip to various eras and so forth. One of the things you'll see also in the book is he lived long enough to see Hanford and what was sitting there, but didn't quite understand it all. But at that time, you see it spoken about is in nuclear power for peace and so forth. So,
Yeah,
which is the way history works.
another era.
Your family was friends with Neuberger's family, or
Yeah.
and his family, and you spent 40 years researching. And from the bibliography, you did quite a bit of research all over the place. Was there anything about him that surprised you that you didn't know about before you wrote the book, while you were doing the research?
Well, a lot of this, especially the contradiction, because that was a surprise, of course. The relationship with Maureen was not a surprise. I knew a lot about it, but it deepened my sense their bond through that. And then I was very surprised, which you'll see at the end of the story, where his final death grows, if you will. It's not so simple as he had a cerebral hemorrhage. That was what was put on the death certificate. It's much more complicated than that. And I invite you to read the book to find out why. But if you're a physician, especially when you practice in that era, or a nurse who practices in that era, you'll understand how things were different then and what might have happened. But there's just colliding bits of information on what went on that day and that night. I will say this much: it was clear that they really he needed to leave the scene, because he dies only like 3 days before the end of filing day. He's already filed as a placeholder, and he was saying because everyone else knew that he was in ill health, if you will. cancer, testicular cancer, which had migrated to his lungs and to his brain eventually. If you see what the physician says, Dr. Mark Goodman. Um, and but uh, but he kept up a you could I don't know whether it was denial or it was the public face, I don't know, but nobody, even within the family, knew when he died so suddenly. It was a shock to Anne and Kate, um, and, uh, and he never really led on to how seriously ill he was, if he understood that. Big question.
Didn't sound like it in the book that he understood.
Yeah, no,
Nobody was saying anything to him.
no, because he was such a hypochondriac.
But there was also a time when doctors didn't necessarily tell their patients the truth, right?
Yeah,
Of
their
their condition.
you see Goodman essentially saying that
Yeah.
in there. Yeah. Yeah. So that did surprise me. And I guess I didn't also understand what the student experience that he went through at University of Oregon was like. Of course, it had to do with the depression in many cases. He said, I don't know that it cut the enrollment in half, but it was down to like when he was there, 3,800. He decided to like New England College. And so he, and especially in terms of living, the women's dorms were in something half empty. And so what he advocated was, why not cut the tuition or the rent? They're empty already. And you built them, the university, so forth. It's something that all the schools dealt with. And he quotes the University of Iowa where they did a similar thing, and the student there used barter to pay for the tuition. But if you ask around to people of that era who are waning now, you will find a similar story. My mother had that story. She had to leave the University of Oregon in her junior year, I guess, or sophomore, to go back to the newspaper, run it, help run it. And so my
And
father,
people paid for their subscriptions with eggs.
with eggs, yeah, they would bring eggs into the newspaper. Pay the subscription. So
Tried that one time.
I'll bet you did.
How did you happen?
Actually, I remember throwing it at your window. I didn't like your.
Yeah, sure.
Steve, what would you like readers to take away from the book in terms of the message?
Well, what I'm finding is that those who've read it, and even when I had a manuscript to show to a few people, I didn't know that. Even people of that era, it's like I didn't know that, which is a delight in many ways, because you want to, with any story, you want to tell the story. You want people to know the story, and either that they didn't know about that era, or what was going on in that era, or about him. He's a very unlikely character. I've made many presentations. In one presentation, I think it was at the Oregon Jewish Museum, I said sort of he was a one-off. You really can't compare him to anyone then or now in his capacities. His top aide, Lloyd Toppling, said that when they would go to do his radio broadcasts in the studio, that he would bring no notes, and he would do the whole thing without break, without halting. Anyway, it was as though he saw this radio script in his head and just was reading it, and so forth. I have a television show, Face the Nation, the video of it. I didn't bring it. It's a little more complicated to bring. But again, what's so interesting is listening to him answer questions. He doesn't hesitate one bit, just out it comes.
So like his writing.
Yeah, like his writing, same thing, that capacity. And his there are still a lot of precocious young, politicians around, of course, but he was especially so. And then it's especially surprising that he would choose to go to Nazi Germany. He knew who was in power, and he knew he's Jewish, and um, so those were surprises, I guess.
He, as you write, he sort of brought Oregon into the Democratic fold,
Yeah,
and I wonder if he also, as a prominent Jew, if he brought more credibility or the presence of into this community in Portland. I mean, it seems like there, with Herb Schwab and other
Yeah.
notable people, in the '60s and '70s.
mhm.
Is that you think there was a relation that that Neuberger had a hand in that?
I am not sure about that, really, Mike. It's an interesting question. One of the things that as you'll see in my preface, people and the acknowledgements that people I reached out to within the Jewish community to tell me about Jewish Portland in the 30s and 40s and so forth. And so I didn't know any of that. But one of the things I will tell you is that after the war, of course, there was much more awareness and acceptance of Jews because people knew what had gone on in Germany. But at the same time, it was still 1950 again that major Portland locker would hire a Jew. The Portland clubs would admit a Jew. That didn't happen until like the 1960 or something like that. Yeah. So that's another matter. What is interesting, and I have it in the book, is that his being elected was a big deal. It's a big deal to conservationists and to Jews. And it's apparent in the interview he gives to a writer named Jeremiah Ben Jacob, who was with Congress Weekly, in the sort of the get to know you interview that I used to give to new members of Congress like Rob White and so forth, which is the who are you and what are you going to be and all that sort of thing. And so what Ben Jacob writes is that Neuberger, he said the surprising thing is about this guy is that he's a genuine egghead. He's an intellectual and a writer and all this sort of thing. And that he's Jewish, and he writes about that he's going to bring a new sensibility to the Senate for that. What's interesting is he was the second Jew. During the screening of New York was the first. New York, obviously. Oregon, not so obvious. The second Jew would come from Oregon. And today, I think Ron Wyden is the 17th, something like that. And it was beyond that because Ron moved to the Senate in 90 something, I guess.
Did you interview in Bozeman?
No, I know that story. I mean, he broke with Mrs. Neuberger because he was her legislative intern, and he broke with her over civil rights.
What?
He was also assigned, his big job with her was to work on an anti-smoking book that she was interested in at the time.
Yeah,
And this was not a popular topic in 62.
yeah.
And he was annoyed that he didn't have something of greater
Greater
Yeah.
significance.
and significance.
Yeah.
So it was his way out was to go with the civil rights
Yeah,
activities.
yeah, yeah. That's where I met him. I was her page, and he was her intern, and so I could see kind of
Oh,
what
so maybe you knew that. I just
No, I didn't.
our office down home.
I didn't know that. It's news to me. You pick up stuff about someone like Neuberger, and over time, I had no idea until I was having coffee with Bill Robbins up in the stairs in the Virginia Historical Society during one of the book fairs where you go and just sell your books and all that sort of thing. And a woman overheard us, and she said, you're writing about Neuberger?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, do you know about his promotion of prevention of cruelty to animals. And it was section and all that sort of stuff. And I said, no. And so she said, well, I will send you some things and that you will not have seen. And so she did. And it's in there. It's a bill that he sponsored, I think, supported whatever the role was that he had in it. But it had to do with cruelty to animals, to put it very overarching. It was much more particular than that. Had a cat named Muffet. So pleased to get the picture of Muffets in the book. It was a very cat would go across the country with him and her in the train. Hard to believe. A basket that it lived in, and so forth. So,
Steve, what do you think Newberg would have thought about today's politics?
oh, you got to wonder.
You don't have to wonder.
No, you don't have to wonder. No, I'd be appalled, of course. At the both parties, not both. The Republicans, they're suddenly the inarticulate party. They got nothing to say. You know, back when I was writing editorials and so forth, I would occasionally make the point that the Republican Party in Oregon really needed a Neuberger because they were stuck on two things: abortion and homosexuality. And that was the litmus test to get nominated. And nobody ever took me up on that.
Why did was McCall a Republican?
Well, so was Hatfield. In those days, there was a lot of the early Oregon Republicans were progressive Republicans.
Yeah.
In the model of Theodore Roosevelt.
Right.
Yeah.
The center line has moved.
Yeah.
Really, the
Yeah.
center, there are so many Democrats today that Democrats during the period of the Neuberger because the Democratic Party has embraced and has gone conservative in a bigger way than it was in those days.
Yeah, that might be the case. Yeah.
I mean, I just think that center line is really moved and we're not even conscious of it.
Well, and
I mean, Eisenhower would have been a Democrat.
yeah. Yeah,
Nixon started the EPA.
well, he did. I remember when Henry Jackson, Senator of Washington, said once he said, I had to go down to the White House to tell President Nixon why he needed to sign the Environmental Protection Act.
Does anybody have any questions?
Please, third.
Like the Neuberger won by 1,400 votes.
2,300.
22,642.
Oh, statewide,
Yeah.
and then, but more than that in Multnomah County. So maybe it might have been the first indication of the urban-rural divide. That's in the past important.
Good point. Good point. Yeah. The other factor I didn't mention, but the other factor in his victory is that the Republicans did not vote in numbers that they had been voting in. They didn't turn out for portion. And
Demographically, much more real estate than
it was an provincial state. It really was. Yeah.
Also, you've said that Gordon didn't take Neuberger seriously.
No, Gordon was very late to the party. And interesting, Neuberger might have been insecure and so forth, but Gordon didn't like publicity. He's liked to show off. And it was very typical of the senators in those days if they were members of the club. If you remember the club, you don't say much, but you get a lot done. And so, but for Gordon, this extended to campaigning. He didn't like doing it. Showing off, shall we say. Dick was exactly the opposite.
And Maureen
Which
was
underscores
somewhat helpful too. So
Yeah.
Maureen was helpful to her.
Oh, enormously helpful. She, my mother told this anecdote about taking the neighbors to Weston, which is a farm community outside Pendleton. And how before the speech Dick would make, there'd be a few people talking to Dick, but in the other corner of the room would be Maureen with a cluster of farm women. As they were identified, she grew up in Cloverdale down the coast from here, dairy farm. She was a farm girl, and they could. And as I don't know which Ann or Kate said, you know, she could talk to anyone. Maureen had that capacity. So we were talking earlier about Tom McCall or Hatfield had that capacity. I've often said if you were, you know, marooned on the old desert island, you know, with someone, there's a lot of those politicians you wouldn't choose, but definitely get by with, because you can talk about Christianity and the various churches and Oregon history and U.S. history and
Presidential history.
pardon me?
Presidential history.
Yeah, presidential history. Fascinating guy he was. Yeah. People didn't appreciate that or see it, whatever he was. Anyway. Well, good. Other questions. Thank you all for coming. We get the
I was curious, of the photograph where you told us that Senator Morse, then Dean Morse, flunked it in one of his classes. He was only 1 year into